Hi, everybody. I'm Daniel Wallach, the founder of Wallach Legal. I'm also the co-host of the Conduct Detrimental Sports Law podcast, along with Dan Lust. Dan is away this week on special assignment, so I'm taking over the reins. Today's episode of Conduct Detrimental will take a detour to the bluegrass state. We turn our focus to the Commonwealth of Kentucky's unique gambling landscape. Long known as the horse racing capital of the world, Kentucky has expanded its gaming footprint in recent years to embrace new forms of gambling. Two in particular. Not only did Kentucky become the first state to pass a sports betting law in 2023, only 3 states have done that as of early June, but it is the nation's capital of a relatively new form of gambling called historical horse racing. That's right, betting on replays of previously run horse races. That actually exists, and it's a huge business. 9 states have already legalized it, including Kentucky, Virginia, Louisiana, Wyoming, New Hampshire. It dates all the way back to Arkansas, but it is picked up, dates back to Arkansas in the year, I think, 1999 or 2000, but it has really garnered momentum in recent years, largely because of the efforts of Kentucky. And shockingly, within Kentucky, betting on old, previously run horse races does even bigger business than betting on live horse races. Just to put a finer point on it, in fiscal year 2022, the handle for betting on previously run horse races was $6.8 billion. That sounds like a sports betting handle in New York. It generated close to 500 million, that's right, $500 million in revenues for the horse race tracks, and over $100 million in state tax collections. Comparing that to all the states that have legalized sports wagering since the dawn of the post-PASPA era, Kentucky's HHR state tax collections probably are greater than any other state has generated on legal sports betting, with the exception of New York. And when you think about the size of Kentucky relative to its output for historical horse racing, it gives you a sense of the enormity of the appeal to HHR. So we're going to begin with definitional questions with our guest today. We're going to ask, what is historical horse racing? Why is it so successful? Can it save the racing industry? How does it benefit live horse racing? And how does it benefit state governments? But not surprisingly, historical horse racing has spawned litigation across the country, and attorney generals from several states have weighed in on this topic. But has Kentucky created the blueprint for overcoming any legal obstacles? Do other states now have a blueprint to follow? Joining us today to help answer these questions is former Kentucky State Representative Adam Koenig, who, as chairman of the House Licensing and Occupations Committee, was instrumental in getting both sports betting and historical horse racing passed into law. Today, Adam is the owner of Koenig Public Policy and Political Consulting, specializing in gaming, alcohol, banking, insurance, and local government, the so-called 5 vices. So today, he's also the executive director of the Kentucky Quarter Horse Racing Association. So I think it's pretty safe to say Adam is well-versed in the state of historical horse racing and horse racing in Kentucky. So Adam, without further ado, with that long windup, welcome to Conduct Detrimental. How are you, my friend?
Thank you. You should say welcome back. This isn't my first time, so I appreciate being on here, and I'm looking forward to discussing this topic. It should be fun.
You're part of an exclusive fraternity of return guests. I think we have maybe less than 10, maybe Darren Ravel, Darren Heitner. I will go through the list another time, but
That's a good crowd.
Within the state lawmaking space, I think you're only the second repeat state lawmaker. Joe Adabo from New York is the only other one, so you stand in very exclusive company.
Yes.
Let's begin with the basic definitional question, because most of our audience may have never seen an HHR machine or an HHR terminal, like what it looks like. First of all, what is historical horse racing, going beyond just you can bet on previously run races?
Well, it's a method of pari-mutuel wagering, and yes, it is as simple as wagering on previously run races. And when it first started in Arkansas, as you mentioned, I think it was in the late 90s. It was a very rudimentary method of betting on previously run races. There was a little tiny screen at the top that would show you the last couple seconds, but there would be like sevens and cherries and everything else that made it look like a slot machine. And it wasn't very interactive, but it provided the opportunity for Arkansas. I was thinking Oaklawn, for Arkansas to generate money for racing. And now it is still it's more complicated in that typically, at least in Kentucky, all the races that are utilized have to have run with 12 horses. There were no scratches, and a few other requirements like that. And when you dig into it, you're actually basically wagering on 10 different races with the numbers chosen typically for you. But if you push enough buttons, you can go in, see some rudimentary data, and make your own selections on which horses you want to pick in each of those 10 races. And that's all, I mean, obviously, late 90s, you don't know the results of a race that was run 15 years ago at Arlington Park.
Some people might. So
some people might.
How did the machines select the races and, take the steps necessary to reduce discovery by the patron who
Exactly.
is armed with the knowledge of the race? Like, this is the 8th race at Churchill Downs on September 19th, 2008. I mean, that's a surefire winner. So what kind of inventory are we talking about? Are the names of the horses shown? Is the entire race revealed? Can you tell us pictorially what the machine looks like and how it functions?
Today, it looks like a regular slot machine, which is what the consumer wants. They want the bells and whistles and lights and the interactive nature that slot machines look like today. But instead of the outcome being chosen by a random number generator, the outcome already exists. The question is, can you pick which ones win? Now, obviously, most people ask the computer to pick their horses for them. But like I said, if you hit enough buttons, you can get some rudimentary information such as speed, class, lifetime earnings, things like that, in comparison to the other horses, and make some selections based upon that rudimentary information. And that is what differentiates it from a regular slot machine.
Is it sufficiently skill-based to be different slot machines?
Well, I mean, there is some skill in it, which makes it more skillful, obviously, than a slot machine. And frankly, I'd like to see a little bit more, and we can get into some of the bills I've had and try to require that it be easier to find that information, that it be more easily accessible. But that notwithstanding, it's pari-mutuel. And as I try to explain to legislators, because they see a slot machine like thing and they say, well, if it looks like a slot machine, acts like a slot machine, it's a slot machine. Well, no. In one, the decision is made by a random number generator. In the other, it is pari-mutuel in that, the decision has already been made. The outcome is already known. It's just a matter of whether or not you can pick the correct horses that match the outcome.
I think another point of departure between HHR terminals and slot machines, which is very significant legally in my view, is that slot machines, besides being the algorithms and random number generators determining the winnings, it's a house bank game. You're competing against the house. The patron loses the coin and it's kept by the house, and vice versa. When the patron wins, the house loses. Historical horse racing is pari-mutuel in nature, which is vastly different, and it's a dispositive in many states. That's considered a dispositive distinction between casino style gaming and pari-mutuel horse race style wagering. Can you explain for our audience what you mean by pari-mutuel wagering? I can do it, but it might have a unique definition in Kentucky.
Well, I'll do my best, and you can fill in the gaps where I leave things out or get things not quite right. like you said, it's just, look, you go to a horse race, we'll pick Keeneland, which is a beautiful place in Lexington. If you haven't been, you should go. Where, the first race, everyone's putting in their wagers on various types of bets, win, play, show, trifecta, exacta, whatever it may be. And the house is going to get X amount of dollars from that. Typically 20% is kind of a standard for across all bets, across all tracks. And the other 80% is going to be pushed back out to the winners. So you can have some skill. If you play a slot machine with a random number generator long enough, you're going to lose, period. If you have some amount of skill in horse racing, you can win, or shall we say, lose less than the other people that you are wagering against. So it's a matter of how much of that 80% you can win back for yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I look at it as almost like peer-to-peer wagering, in that the wagers on a particular race or set of races are placed in a single pool. And after deducting the takeout to pay for the operating expenses of the racetrack, the remaining funds are distributed to the winning bettors pro rata or in proportion to the amount of their bets. So it's not a house-banked type of gaming like slot machines are. And I think that is an important distinction. But before we get to some of the legal headwinds that are obviously part of the Kentucky story, let's take a step back and look at the benefits that have been associated with historical horse racing. Like, why is there even a need for historical horse racing when you have live horse racing in Kentucky?
Well, historical horse racing filled multiple needs in Kentucky. When it was first started at Kentucky Downs by Corey Johnson, who owned Kentucky Downs, it still is a small track, but it has a small footprint in the world of thoroughbred horse racing, and started taking the instant racing model from Arkansas and using it to start generating money for purses largely. And that got the historical horse racing ball rolling in Kentucky. And it's important today because with it now, not only do we have the best purses in America for thoroughbreds, hands down, which is bringing more and more horses here, which generates obviously a larger amount of money, but it also generates larger fields. People like to bet on larger fields because they get better odds and better payouts, which then increases the amount of money that is wagered in Kentucky, largely from a simulcast audience. And it filled a need, and we can get into this more in that, and you know this very well, we don't have casinos in Kentucky. They're basically outlawed in the Constitution. And so it filled a need that was missing. I live in northern Kentucky, right by Cincinnati. We have 4 casinos and a track, a thoroughbred track that has basically a slot parlor. And, people from Kentucky were taking their money across into Indiana and Ohio on a regular basis. Now they get to play similar games in Kentucky, keep that money here, and that money goes to fund purses all across the state in some instances. The 2 up by me, they're specifically for Turfway Park, and feed those purses. But there's now these historical horse racing machine facilities all across the state.
Yeah, and in other states, horse race tracks are being closed down. You're actually building additional tracks.
Yes, we are.
Is that attributable to HHR, you think?
Absolutely. Look, we had a basis of, you go back 10 years, you had Churchill, you had Keeneland, which are kind of the flagships. Everybody knows Churchill, home of the Kentucky Derby, Keeneland, Turfway up by me, which is out this back window, a mile or 2, and Ellis Park. And you had a harness track in Lexington called Red Mile, which is one of my clients. And that was more or less the essence of racing in Kentucky. Now we've got 2 new harness tracks, one of which is called Oak Grove, which is in Hopkinsville, which is where Fort Campbell is, and a new one that is almost done being built and they're about to start racing at, called Cumberland, which is on southern part of I-75, right next to Tennessee. And then we can get into the quarter horse, but there's a quarter horse track being built in Ashland. Of course, the historical horse racing machine facility is being built first. It's supposed to be open in October. And those last three projects I mentioned would not have existed without legalized historical horse racing in Kentucky.
Does it attract a different kind of demographic than live horse race tracks? When we used to go to the track growing up, in New York, Roosevelt Raceway, you'd see a much older crowd, going to see horse racing and betting on horse racing. I know they've made efforts to, attract, younger patrons, but does HHR appeal to a different kind of consumer, or is it just simply more horse race betting more conveniently?
It appeals to a different type of consumer, the people that would like to go to a casino and play slot machines, or as a lot of these places will have sports books in a few months, and have that experience, have the dinner, play the games, go to the bar, whatever it may be. And in that time, hopefully they're exposed to horse racing. And maybe, hopefully in the future, more people will come and see our live horse racing product going forward. And I think that is a serious plus.
Several times during our conversation, you've made allusions to slot machine gaming and sort of the connective tissue that is sort of similar or connects historical horse racing to slot machines. It looks like a slot machine in many ways. From the consumer experience, it seems like a slot machine, but that gets right to the heart of the legal debate, which has, taken up court decisions, attorney general rulings. This is really the heart of it. Is HHR a form of pari-mutuel wagering, or is it really slot machine casino style gaming? And we went through the fundamental distinctions between house banked slots and skill-based peer-to-peer pari-mutuel wagering. I mean, regardless of what it looks like on the cabinet, the functionality and the payout and the house edge, completely different. They're not slot machines, but that hasn't always proven to be so clear-cut and dispositive to regulators, attorney generals, and judges in other states. So let's get into some of the legal challenges that you faced in Kentucky and have successfully overcome, because I believe that they can be instructive to policymakers in other states who want to learn more about historical horse racing and whether there's a sort of a method to being able to properly legalize it to avoid or minimize the risk of a legal challenge. You've had dealings, or the Commonwealth has had a number of lawsuits over the years filed by the Family Foundation, which is a religious organization that is opposed to gambling expansion. And they've had historical horse racing in their crosshairs going back a full decade, and they've tried to derail HHR for many years. They've been successful in a few of the early court cases. So if you can summarize or identify what were the objectionable aspects of historical horse racing that became the key issues in several of these lawsuits and court rulings. What were they complaining about? It looks like slot machines, or this really wasn't pari-mutuel wagering? And if so, where did they place their argument?
Well, I think these look like slot machines is for public consumption, and making that argument. The actual legal arguments, which I'm sure you can also chime in on, were that it wasn't done properly, that it's not constitutional, and that it was, the statutory language did not match. And there was a couple suits that, well, let me back up. When Kentucky Downs started it, there were some regulations promulgated by the Kentucky Horse Racing Commission to govern it while it was being done and while the legalities were being worked out. For first time, Supreme Court said it's okay under the regulations. The second time, they said it was okay, but they remanded something back to the lower courts. The third time, I believe that was 2020, when they got it back to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said, "Oh, you know what? We've decided that you shouldn't be doing it by regulation. You need a statutory change," and that was in September. We have a session that starts every January, and basically, it more or less gave us. They basically invited the legislature to fix the statute, or else it was going to go away. So it was more or less a one-time shot
I think
to get
you
it done.
identified a crucial issue. In many states, historical horse racing was authorized by regulatory bodies that just simply promulgated rules allowing historical horse racing, and then the courts, lawsuits get filed, attorney generals are asked to give advisory opinions, and then HHR gets shut down. But when you've done it legislatively, it normally sticks. I think by my measure, of the 9 states that have legalized HHR, 8 have done so through the legislative process. And in most of the states where HHR was launched and then blocked by court ruling or AG opinion, the regulatory rulemaking process was used. So I think that's a really interesting observation about the importance of educating state legislators on how to properly define pari-mutuel wagering, because in many instances, pari-mutuel wagering, the way it's defined by statute, dates back like 100 years. It's this archaic definition that doesn't use the word previously run or historical. In many cases, it just speaks of horse racing, and then there are references to live racing throughout the statutory scheme. And the courts have highlighted the failure of state legislatures to expand the definition of pari-mutuel wagering to include previously run races. Well, that's easy to fix. Where Kentucky ran into a few problems were 2 aspects of historical horse racing, in that the patrons were not wagering on the same races. You were pooling wagers from different historically run races and creating a giant pool. And the Kentucky Supreme Court, I guess, declared or ruled that wasn't true pari-mutuel wagering based upon the pre-existing definition of pari-mutuel wagering under Kentucky law. And then additionally, the initial pools were funded by the Racing Association in HHR, whereas traditionally the patrons fund the pool. And those 2 aspects were highlighted by the Kentucky Supreme Court, in that you had wagering on multiple disconnected, randomly selected horse races, and then the Racing Association could fund the initial pool. And you fixed that.
Exactly. And when you talk about funding the initial pool, that's what's called a minus pool in the business. And yeah, them putting up money in advance, because if the very first person wins that ever makes an HHR wager in a state, well, there's no money in the pool for them to get, so someone's got to seed that fund. So we allow for that, knowing that eventually, it's going to get paid back and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, look, pari-mutuel laws, and if you've had horse racing in your state, whichever state it is, for 100 plus years, like Kentucky, your pari-mutuel laws are outdated. I haven't looked at them, but I can tell you they're outdated. And whether it's HHR or anything else, after we passed this, we co-chaired with my good friend Damon Thayer, who none of this would have happened without his influence. But we co-chaired a group to look at the pari-mutuel laws and overhaul things that were 100 years old. But getting back to the topic, yeah, you've got minus pools, you've got other opportunities. And when I carried the bill on the House floor, that was a large part of my argument was, look, we got a bunch of 100-year-old items in our pari-mutuel statutes. And what we're doing is modernizing them, because when this was last opened, more or less, the only bet you could make was a win bet. You had to make it in person at the track. Things have changed, and now is the time to bring all these statutes up to today's world. It was an opportunity, frankly, to make it much better and hopefully provide a template for other states. But yeah, it was more or less, in the most simplistic manner, a modernization of our pari-mutuel laws.
Yeah, two changes in particular that are, I think, instructive to lawmakers should be instructive to lawmakers from other states. You change the definition of pari-mutuel wagering to allow wagers to be placed in one or more wagering pools, and that the wagers can be on different races or sets of races, and all those wagers could be pooled together. And then beyond that, you expanded the language to allow funding, initial pool funding by the Racing Association. So once you have this expanded definition, then the statute or the statutory definition of pari-mutuel wagering lines up with the actual implementation of historical horse racing in Kentucky, which is in conformity with this expanded statutory language. And you raised you took a word out of my mouth that I was about to say, in that has Kentucky written the template to show other states how to legalize historical horse racing?
I like to think so. Every state is different. They have their own rules, and frankly, they have everyone might have different motivations, whether it's funding the general fund or helping their horse racing industry and whatnot. And a whole other part of it, which maybe is a whole other show, is the tax rate. How high should the tax rate be? And we split it up into many different little parts. Only part of it goes to the general fund. A lot of it goes into actual horse racing purses, breeders incentive funds, et cetera, et cetera. But yeah, I mean, I think
the tax imposed on handle.
Yeah.
What's the handle tax in the Commonwealth?
The tax is 1.5% gross.
Okay.
Of which maybe half of it goes to the general fund. The rest of it is mandated to go to various person accounts, backside improvements on tracks, like I said, breeders incentive funds. And again, that's, so much of that. And Kentucky is very blessed to have certainly the best thoroughbred breeding program in America, if not the world. And we're growing in the other ones. And, there's a lot of pluses to having a burgeoning, growing, big breeders incentive fund. It's an agricultural product. It's environmentally friendly. A lot of these horse farms in Kentucky would be subdivisions if it weren't for breeding and incentives. So, there's a lot of pluses to it. There's just so many jobs for vets and
the whole equine industry
companies.
Depends upon it.
It is huge. I mean, I think the estimate was 60,000 direct and indirect jobs in Kentucky because of horse racing on various levels, and a large part of that is the breeding system.
What would have happened had you not passed an updated HHR law in Kentucky and it goes away? What would have been the consequence?
Top level Churchill Downs and Keeneland would have survived. Most of the rest of the tracks would have disappeared. The budget would have taken a huge hit. And all the big time sires and mares would have started slowly, but eventually they would have made their way to other states where the breeder incentive fund and the state bred races would pay more money.
Okay, well, parenthetically, in discussing Kentucky's law as a template or a blueprint for other states, Louisiana passed an historical horse racing authorization law a couple of months after you did, and they lifted your language. They stole it verbatim and used it exactly. And to date, Louisiana's system is ongoing. No lawsuits. There are no lawsuits pending against historical horse racing in Kentucky. It's pretty much become bulletproof because of the legislative efforts to expand the definition of pari-mutuel wagering at the prompting of the Kentucky Supreme Court, which pointed out a number of the deficiencies in the existing, pari-mutuel wagering statute. So then why have so few states, since Louisiana, why have so few states considered this as an option? I mean, I mentioned earlier in the podcast, only 9 states have legalized HHR. It generates more money, hand over fist than live horse racing, Kentucky being, proof of that. Yet since 2020, 2021, I believe, or maybe early 2022, there have been no bills introduced that have passed through state legislatures. It remains stagnant at 9. Why do you suspect that HHR hasn't taken off? Is it because of constitutional requirements? Is there stakeholder opposition? Or could it be an issue of the lawmakers in certain states not really understanding the lure of historical horse racing and just not being well educated on it?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, like every state's different, and I'll get to that in a second. But when you say we're bulletproof, I just want to mention that Churchill Downs pushed really hard for us to just lift Virginia's HHR language, and we refused to do that because we're a different state and we had different needs, and that's the way it is with every other state. Look, if you already have casinos, I can't imagine there's a huge desire or market need for HHR unless it's specifically designed to help the horse racing industry. Standalone, like I said earlier, Kentucky doesn't have casinos. We're surrounded by states that did, with the exception of Tennessee. And so, there was a pent-up demand for a product like this.
Yeah, but Adam, there are 40 states, 40 so states that already have commercial or tribal casinos. So by that rationale,
Sure.
we're going to remain frozen at like 9 or 10 states because most of the country has the
Sure.
access to traditional slot machines.
Right.
But there are a number of states where horse racing is on the decline,
Mm-hmm.
or there are state lawmakers who are threatening to end subsidies for racetracks. In states like New York and Pennsylvania, some of the slot machine and VLT revenues are earmarked to help stabilize live horse racing in those states. And with the spate of horse deaths happening around the country, Churchill Downs now has a crisis. New York, California have had similar ones as well. That has provided as a springboard or a bully pulpit for some lawmakers to say, you know what, we should end subsidies for horse race tracks and divert those slot machine VLT revenues to education or something else. Can historical horse racing, even in a state that has access to slot machines, can HHR save or stabilize the horse racing industry? And there are 2 states in particular. We look at New York, Pennsylvania, California, Florida. Would historical horse racing potentially be viable in those markets?
Absolutely. I mean, look, I think that particularly in New York, I think that there's opportunities if the time comes where some of these folks want to get rid of the quote unquote subsidies that they provided, and these are actual products. I don't really think they're subsidies because it's not a check written out of the general fund per se. But let's say that was the case. You say, okay, well then if you're not going to let us have this, and you're going to take it away, let us have historical horse racing, and we can just modernize our pari-mutuel laws, clean it up. Is it always a good way for a legislator to say, we're going to fix this, and we're just going to, it's a little cleanup language that would enable them to sell it as we are taking care of our own using the same pari-mutuel product that we have on the track. It's just on historical races. I think that's a great opportunity for any state to, whether it's Nebraska, to bump up their tracks, which I think is being done now, or New York to say, okay, well, here's a product. If you're going to take something away, let us have this so that we can continue to be, New York's one of the biggest competitors for Kentucky. I mean, you can probably make an argument that we're the top 2 markets. I mean, when you got Saratoga and one of the Triple Crown races in Belmont, New York's a very important part of the thoroughbred industry.
Yeah, and that's what's always puzzled me about New York's, I guess, failure to embrace historical horse racing. The New York Constitution already allows pari-mutuel betting on horse races. In a number of other states, Oregon, for example, recently had an attorney general's opinion which characterized HHR as a violation of the state constitutional prohibition against casinos and slot machines, I believe. So there are constitutional questions that are raised if you try to legalize HHR through the legislative process in certain states. New York doesn't have that impediment because there is already a carve out in the state constitution for pari-mutuel betting. So it becomes the prerogative of the state legislature to decide whether and to what extent they want to sort of, bend or extend or, expand the definition of pari-mutuel wagering to accommodate HHR. I mean, think of all the improvements that some of that Belmont Park needs and harness racing. I mean, I think of the 10 or 12 or so live horse race tracks in New York State, the vast majority of them are standard bred / harness horse racing, and they are suffering. They are doing very poorly. And, Belmont in particular needs significant, subsidies to be able to fund improvements to the track. That's one of the grand dames of,
Sure.
of the horse racing industry in the United States. But it raises an issue. The obstacle isn't the legislation or the language in the state constitution. The objection is going to come from other stakeholders, commercial casinos and tribal casinos. They've been viewing that. They've been viewing historical horse racing as a threat to their slot machine / casino product. How do you get around or satisfy the concerns of the commercial casino and tribal industry or tribal gaming industry? How do you circumvent that or navigate?
Well, I mean, it sounds like look, in Kentucky, again, I mentioned we were fortunate in that we didn't have any casino interests in Kentucky to argue with. And we don't have tribal issues in Kentucky either. That's not the case in a lot of these other states, and New York being one of them. Sounds to me like in New York, it's already clearly outlined in the Constitution. At some point, someone, particularly a harness track, might just want to start putting them in and ask for forgiveness rather than permission.
Right, or OTBs. I don't know if
Sure.
it can be done. It might be able to be done as a regulatory rulemaking initiative, but when you think about the track record of historical horse racing being successful through legislation and having failures through the regulatory rulemaking process, I think the asking for forgiveness rather than permission might be a good short-term solution, but in the long run, you're going to fall flat unless it spurs the need for some legislation. But I think New York would be a perfect environment for it because of the breadth of the language in the New York State Constitution, the sheer number of live horse race tracks, and the affinity for horse racing in New York, juxtaposed against a call to eliminate or reduce some of the subsidies being given to horse race tracks in the state of New York. So I think New York could be an especially attractive candidate for the legalization of HHR. And I didn't mention another stakeholder, the OTBs. New York has over 100 off-track betting parlors. There's Western OTB, Catskills OTB, Nassau, Suffolk. There are over 100 OTB locations. And another state that has slot machine gaming, horse racing, tribes, and OTBs were able to carve out a niche for historical horse racing to be given to the OTBs. So I think the prime candidate in New York could be the off-track betting corporations, which currently don't receive the subsidies that some of the live horse race tracks receive. I think that could be that could be where you thread the needle in New York State. So, to wrap up, I mean, you've thought about historical horse racing a lot. Where do you see the next wave of states coming from? Any suggestions to maybe cherry pick, a couple that you see coming online within the next year or two?
Well, gosh, I mean, I know that Oklahoma has a lot of tribes, and that would be an issue, but they also, have a solid racing, thoroughbred and quarter horse. That might be someplace decent. Arizona, who has I know they have a lot of tribes as well, but they've got 2 tracks, and Turf Paradise, the bigger one, which is a C level track when it comes to thoroughbreds, is closing probably in the next couple of years, almost for certain. These are opportunities, and I know there's been efforts to try to get Arizona to legalize it.
Well, they
And
had it,
even,
they had it and lost it. They had it a long time ago, and there was an attorney general's opinion in 2014.
Mhm.
I think it said it violated the Arizona Constitution or violated tribal exclusivity. But if there can be some revenue sharing, I think it's a revenue stream that
Mhm.
can be, access to benefit all stakeholders. It doesn't have to be exclusively reserved to the horse race tracks. It can be used
Right.
to help fund, tribal gaming operations. It's a revenue source that is waiting to be tapped into. But I think by virtue of this Arizona Attorney General's opinion, I think there has to be some strong legislative push for it, and I'm not sure that there is right now. I'm hoping.
There
That
was this year, and I can't get into who, but I know there was an effort to get them to by folks who wanted to buy Turf Paradise, and
okay,
they were going to be willing to do so if they could get historical horse racing machines in to compete. And that effort will probably continue going forward. But I mean, that's a big market in all of Arizona.
not big enough to support hockey. Apparently, the Arizona Coyotes are getting kicked out of every city. Phoenix,
Sure,
Glendale, and maybe
bizarre,
soon Tempe.
which is bizarre, but and horse racing, I think, is more part of the culture in Arizona, and I'm learning quarter horses in the Southwest are huge. The biggest race in America for quarter horse racing is somewhere between Albuquerque and El Paso in New Mexico,
Mhm.
a place called Ruidoso. And it's huge, and I think a track could run thoroughbred and quarter horse racing.
Yeah.
But the look, historical horse racing probably doesn't work everywhere, but there are certainly opportunities. Kentucky and Virginia is another great example. The folks that are bringing quarter horse racing to Kentucky are people who uh, bought Colonial Downs, which was basically shut down, and restarted it, and went to the legislature and said, we need historical horse racing to make this happen. And now I think they have 7 locations throughout Virginia. So they took a defunct track, built it up, built these facilities, and I don't know what they put into it, but I know that they sold it to Churchill for over $2 billion. So I'm pretty sure they made a fair amount of money.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
now they are bringing quarter horse racing to Ashland, Kentucky. And look, it comes with 2 licenses for historical horse racing machine facilities. And that is the driver. I'd like to pretend that, they love quarter horse racing and can't wait to see it happen somewhere. But, that's the driver. And that's okay, because we're going to have some of the best purses in quarter horse racing in about 5 years.
you made a great point. I mean, it saved, not just saved, but it revived horse racing in Virginia, which ceased to exist at that
Mm-hmm.
one track. I don't know if there was
Mm-hmm.
any other racing in Virginia, but Wyoming, another state which legalized historical horse racing,
Yep.
prior to doing so, live horse racing had been kaput. And
Mm-hmm.
HHR has now revived live racing. Uh, More purses are increasing every year, number of live races. It's all been beneficial to the live racing industry. It sounds like to me you've been working and talking with some folks in the industry in other states. Do you work, or are you available to work with stakeholders and lawmakers in other states that have questions about historical horse racing? We could go on the road, Adam. We could
Let's
take this
go.
podcast and visit New York, Florida. I live in Florida, but we can go around the country and talk about the virtues of historical horse racing. Are you doing or interested in doing that kind of consulting as part of your law firm practice?
Absolutely. I would love to. I'd love to help horse racing anywhere in America. It's great, and yeah, I appreciate you asking. I am available, and
Okay.
hopefully left people with the impression that I was knowledgeable. So
Well, you're knowledgeable enough to be the sort of the spiritual champion of sports betting legalization in Kentucky. You're almost, I mean, you're not singularly responsible for it, but you were the champion of legalized sports betting in the Kentucky legislature, Kentucky General Assembly, going all the way back to 2019, 2020. You and I have had many conversations, and finally, you're like the Don Mattingly of the Kentucky legislature. The moment you leave office, they passed a sports betting law. Don Mattingly, never made the playoffs with the New York Yankees until 95, never won a World Series. He retires. Tino Martinez comes in, and the 96 Yankees become the world champions the year after Don Mattingly retires. Do you feel a little bit like Don Mattingly, or are you like a proud papa, feeling that your efforts were the impetus for what ended up happening?
More of the proud papa. It was great. My good friend, Representative Michael Meredith, carried the ball, and in a lot of ways he's a better messenger. He's a rural guy. We needed rural votes to pass it. I was the Yankee of the Kentucky House, and I tended to rub people the wrong way with my bluntness. So I think he was a better messenger in a lot of ways, and I'm just happy it got passed. Looking forward to seeing it happen and being there somewhere. I don't know if I'll be where the governor is, or maybe making the first bet at a particular location.
You deserve the honor of placing the first bet in Kentucky.
Well, I agree, but this is a gubernatorial election year in Kentucky, and so I don't think that's going to happen.
You can get the second bet. A little backstory: I was invited to Monmouth Park Racetrack when New Jersey launched legal sports betting for the first time. Dennis Drazen invited me to the track, and
nice.
I understood that Governor Phil Murphy was going to place the first bet, but I conveniently placed myself at the betting window to make the second bet after Governor Murphy, and I was about to do it. And Dennis Drazen, the head of Monmouth Park Racetrack, basically shoved me out of the way so that Ray Lesniak, the lawmaker who was really singularly responsible for getting sports betting through the New Jersey legislature, he got to make the second bet. I made the third bet. So there's nothing wrong with being Ray Lesniak. You can make the second bet in Kentucky.
Exactly. Well, I get the feeling that maybe at Red Mile or right here behind me at Turfway, I'll be the guy that gets to make the first bet at a particular track, is what it's sounding like, but we'll see.
All right. Well, thank you for all of your efforts to get sports betting passed.
Well, thank you for your help. You were a big help coming to a meeting, and there was a lot of constitutional questions, and after you came and spoke, the constitutional questions disappeared. So it was a big help, and we appreciate it.
Just call me the fixer.
Absolutely. Everybody needs one.
All right. And thank you for enlightening our audience and me with your knowledge about historical horse racing. We'll see where the next phase of HHR takes us, but I think this served as a really good journey and sort of overview of historical horse racing from 2000 all the way to the current time, led largely by the horse racing capital of America in Kentucky. So thank you for joining me on Conduct Detrimental. It's a pleasure as always, Adam, and I look forward to seeing you on the road, either helping other states pass HHR, or we'll see each other at gambling industry conferences. Either way, we'll be seeing each other shortly.
Sounds good, Daniel. Thank you. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Okay, everybody, that's a wrap for this, I guess, 1 hour episode, almost 1 hour episode of Conduct Detrimental. We'll be back next week with the usual group talking about the sports law issues of the day, and probably will focus on the National Football League and the sale of the Washington Commanders. But for this week, this was our gambling episode, and everybody enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you for joining us today on Conduct Detrimental.